Hi, everyone. Uh, Very excited to be here, OTCEP 22. Great discussion so far, a lot of discussions about policy. I know zero about policy. It sounds like Chinese to me, and I do know that most of you know Chinese. Today I'm going to talk to you about multiple researchers we've conducted at Clarity about how to stealthily hide code in PLCs. So let's start a little bit discussing modern PLC architecture. We all know that the main goal of the PLC is to control and orchestrate field devices, sensors, actuators. We need this to control some kind of automation process. It can be, for example, sorting boxes by sizes or by color using a conveyor belt, but the operation is controlled with a PLC. And the PLC has some kind of a logic. It can be a simple one, like this one. So this program reads from a sensor, the flow meter, and if the flow is higher than 30, then in this program we want to open or close the valve. Now, this logic is inside the PLC, and this is what we care about because it controls and changes the behavior of the PLC. So if we want to change the behavior of the PLC, all we need to do is to change the logic running on the PLC. And this is why, from engineering perspective, the only thing matters to us is what is the logic on the PLC. Now, the entire architecture of the PLC needs to support this. It needs to support the actual logic being executed on the PLC. And everything on the PLC and the peripherals needs to support this. So we have the hardware, the vendor drivers, the operating system firmware level, including task, threads, memory, and the kernel itself. Everything needs to support eventually the automation application, whether it's application that is running an elevator or application that runs a flow, a liquid flow. All the kernel services, as you can see here, were created and developed in order to support the highest level of the logic, which is the automation application. So we have proprietary protocol stacks. We have the bytecode runtime interpreter. We have file services. We have C, C++ libraries, so we can support everything to support the automation application. And for example, if we look at the Siemens architecture, the Siemens SIMATIC S7, 1200, and 1500, we will see exactly that. We will see that the proprietary protocol is OMS Plus or S7COM Plus. The entire protocol stack is being implemented in the firmware, of course. The bytecode runtime and the bytecode itself of Siemens is called MC7 Plus. And again, it's a very complex and advanced bytecode to support all the logic that eventually will be executed in the automation layer. So what I want you to understand here is the goal of the PLC is to execute our logic, to control automation process. And this is our prominent and most dominant and important topic when we're talking about PLCs. Now, since we already got familiar a bit about the architecture, we want to talk about the logic itself. So what is a PLC logic? Now, a PLC logic can be very complex, but it can be divided into 4 steps. It can be broken down into 4 steps. First of all, an engineer writes some kind of code that needs to represent actual process. So for example, we've seen previously a simple program that reads value from a sensor, and based on the value read from the sensor, it controls an actuator. And after the engineer developed using the IDE or the engineering working station his code, then the engineering working station will compile this into some kind of a bytecode. So a bytecode is kind of an intermediate language or intermediate code that both the engineering station and the PLC can agree. So it's kind of an abstract way to transfer logic from the engineering working station, where the code is being developed, to the PLC. The next step would be to actually transfer the bytecode to the PLC. Most of the vendors are using proprietary protocols to do that, and we'll see a couple of examples like Siemens OMS Plus or Rockwell SIP. And finally, the last step, again from a high-level perspective, is for the PLC to actually execute the bytecode. So the PLC somehow needs to understand what we want it to behave like, whether it's reading for a sensor, activating an actuator. The PLC needs to understand this logic. And we are here today to talk about this logic and how can we hide it in the PLC, or how can we make the PLC execute a logic such that it will be hidden from the operator or the engineer. So let's get started. The first thing is to develop the actual program. Now, usually we're programming PLCs using IC 61131-3. This is a standard. It contains 5 different PLC programming languages, including a ladder diagram, as you can see here. This is actually a graphical representation of the code that we want the PLC to execute. So this ladder diagram actually tells the PLC, again, from a graphical representation perspective, what to do. Read value from this I/O, send signal to this actuator. This logic code is written by the users, and the users are engineers or operators. They're using the engineering station as IDE, and they're writing their code in the engineering station. You can see a couple of examples. So for example, this is a Studio 5K, Rockwell's engineering working station, and here you can see a simple program that just sets 2 variables, tag A and tag B. It sets 2 variables with numbers, and you can see by the green light nearby the variables, or we call them usually in the OT domain, we call them tags. You can see here it's green, which means the PLC is now connected to engineering station, and they're synced. So whatever the operator is seeing on his screen is what is supposedly or allegedly is currently running on the PLC. And as we will see in a few slides, we were able to circumvent the reality from the engineering perspective, so they will think that this is the code that is actually running on the PLC, while it's not the actual code that's running on a PLC. OK, so this was the first step. This is Rockwell example of an engineering station of how we as engineers are writing our code. Another example is Siemens TIA portal. Here you can see, again, a very graphical, intuitive interface of how to program PLCs. And this is the first step. We're writing our code. This is what the logic we want the PLC to execute, and we have writing it. Now, the next step would be to compile this. So we want to transfer this to kind of an intermediate language so the PLC could understand us. And before actually compiling the bytecode itself, the computer or our engineering station needs to somehow take the beautiful graphical representation of the ladder diagram and do something with it, because the computer obviously doesn't understand the lines we're drawing. So what you can see here is a step before the intermediate bytecode, kind of a step of how the computer or the engineering station is representing the ladder diagram. So you can see here some instructions like SOR that are actually representing what the graphical ladder diagram is doing. So the actual compilation of this code will bring us to the intermediate bytecode. And the intermediate bytecode is a compiled logic, some kind of a shared language between the engineering station and the PLC itself. And how it looks like this. Just random bits and bytes, or at least for me right now, what I'm seeing, it looks random. But it's not really random. It's encoded bytecode that the PLC can actually understand, decode, interpret, and execute. And to do this, there is a special code on the PLC called logic runtime virtual machine. So this is a very complex state machine that knows how to read the binary blob and turn it into something like this. These are intermediate instructions that the PLC will take and execute. Now, obviously, the PLC CPU does not understand this bytecode, so the runtime will actually take these instructions, decode them, interpret them, and eventually run on the actual machine code, the native machine code of the CPUs, of the PLC CPU. And for example, we have ARM processors, we have MIPS processors, we have Coldfire. We have a lot of different processors that will execute our code. So all of these steps together allow us to write our code, what we imagine, what we want the PLC to behave like, and transfer it into actual instructions, actual native code instructions. And this process is very complex and changes between different vendors. Each vendor actually implemented their own routines, their own bytecode, and their own way of how to transfer the code to the PLC. And we researched a lot of them. Specifically in this presentation, I'm going to discuss mostly Siemens and Rockwell because we have done some very thorough research on them. But every vendor in the OT domain has gone through a similar process of how to represent the logic from a high-level perspective, usually ladder diagram, up to the native machine code, the actual CPU executing what we want it to do. Now, as we have said before, we need to transfer the bytecode to the PLC. We want to do what we call a download procedure. We want to take the intermediate bytecode from the engineering station and transfer it to the PLC so the PLC could execute it. And the way to do this is using OT language or OT terminology we call upload or download. We use download to transfer the code from the engineering station to the PLC, and we use upload to get the code from the PLC to the engineering station. Now, a simple download procedure from a high-level perspective looks like this. We have the engineering station. We have the compiled bytecode that we want to transfer. And we're using a proprietary protocol developed by the vendor. For example, Siemens are using OMS+. And the bytecode is transferred to the PLC. So as I said, Siemens, for example, Siemens, we have the bytecode. Siemens bytecode is called MC7+. The proprietary protocol is called S7COM+, or the internal name, as Siemens referred to it, is OMS+. And our PLCs are S7 SIMATIC 1200 and 1500. But again, all we want here is to transfer our logic to the PLC. We want the PLC to change its behavior. Another example is Rockwell. Just like before, we have the engineering station. In this case, it's Studio 5000. We have the Rockwell bytecode, and the proprietary protocol is SIP with vendor-specific functions. The PLC in this case is ControlLogix 5571. And again, these are just examples we mostly worked in our lab. As I said before, our entire purpose of this procedure, the download procedure, is to transfer the logic to the PLC. Now, this is a download procedure, so we're transferring to the PLC. But what happens if you want to take back the code from the PLC? So I want to see what's running on the PLC. That's why we have the upload procedure. In the upload procedure, it's exactly the opposite one. So the bytecode from the PLC will be pulled to the engineering station, and we will get our code. We will see the code in the engineering station, right? So if we will pull the bytecode from the PLC, this is what we will see. Obviously, we're not highly complex state machine VM, and we do not know how to interpret this. So we do need to answer this question. How can we see the actual code running on the PLC? The actual text code running on the PLC, not the bytecode, because I don't know how to read bytecode, just like I don't understand policies. So what we need is a mechanism that will allow us to pull code from the PLC. And to do that, we need to change our minds about download procedure. The download procedure, as I said previously, transfer the bytecode to the PLC. But with the bytecode, we're actually transferring some other data objects like metadata configuration settings and the text code. The textual code is actual code that we're writing, the plain text code, to the PLC. So we're not just transferring the bytecode, but we're also transferring text code, the code that we wrote to program the PLC. Now, if you'll think about this for a little bit, you can see that they're not coupled. So there is the bytecode, the binary code, and there is the text code. So obviously, when we understood this mechanism and this process across the entire ICS market, we asked ourselves, how can we stealthily modify the PLC logic? And the key point here is that the PLC is only using the bytecode. It doesn't care about the text code because it needs to execute the actual code. But the engineering station is only using the text code because this is what we're programming. It doesn't know how to interpret the complex bytecode. So these are decoupled. If we can change or modify one of them and not the other, we will be able to influence what the engineering station is seeing, which will be different from what the PLC is executing. And this is exactly what we did. We took this procedure, the download procedure, the compiled bytecode and the text code, and before transferring to the PLC, we modified just one of them. The PLC doesn't care about the text code. It doesn't understand what is the text code because we already compiled it into bytecode, and the PLC only cares about the bytecode. So when the PLC will receive it, it will execute the bytecode as is. But when we will pull this code from the PLC, the engineering station will see a different code running, but it will not know that the PLC is actually executing a different code than what the engineer is seeing. So if we can summarize this into a table, the normal flow will be transferring a matching code. The bytecode and text code will be the same, and the engineering station, the engineer will see the exact code that is running on the PLC. But in our hiding code techniques attacks, we're actually modifying one of them. We're modifying, for example, the actual bytecode running on the PLC. So when the engineer is pulling the text code from the PLC, it thinks that the original code they wrote is actually being executed on the PLC. So how it looks like, I'm not sure if you can see, the text is too small, but what you can see on the upper side of the screen is 3 tags. And you can see from the left side of the panel that it's green, meaning it's fully synced with the PLC. But if you look below, if you inspect the memory, you will see that the values are actually different from what this program should do, which means the actual bytecode running on the PLC is completely different from what the engineering are seeing on their screens. And this is the basis or the basic concept of how to hide code on PLCs. Now, there are 4 methods being developed not just by our security groups, but also in the world. So let me go over them shortly. First of all, we can intervene in the compilation process. So as I said, we need some kind of mechanism to compile the ladder diagram or the engineering's high-level code into intermediate language, into bytecode. And if we will intervene through this process, we can actually change one of the text code or the bytecode. So I would like to start with Stuxnet. Stuxnet, what it did back then in around 2010 was amazing. It actually changed and shifted the entire security in OT, or started the security in OT. What it did is as follows. It hijacked one of the DLLs responsible of transferring bytecode and text code to the PLC. And through this hijacking, it actually modified the bytecode running on the PLC. How it did this? It waited for a download procedure, and when it received code it needs to transfer to the PLC, it actually replaced it with a predefined and pre-configured code that the attackers wanted to put on the PLC. The thing with Stuxnet is it did not modify just the bytecode or just the text code. It modified both. So on the PLC was the real code, both the text code and the bytecode that the engineers, the attackers in this case, wanted to execute on the PLC. So if someone would have inspected the PLC and pulled the actual text code running on the PLC without the hijacking and the modification through the man in the middle, then they would have seen the actual code the attackers implanted on the PLC. So this was a highly sophisticated attack back then in 2010, but it did not decouple the bytecode and the text code. So what we did is something very similar. We took Studio 5000, the compiler of Studio 5000, and hijacked it. We actually modified the compiler running on the Studio 5000 and replaced it with our own compiler. And our own compiler did something very simple. Once it got a text code to compile, it replaced some of the variables inside the text code. For example, you can see here we replaced some numbers and strings with our predefined code. And it was very simple to do because these compilers are written in modern languages. So we just rewrote some of the compiler logic, and we achieved hijacking compiler. And the result is the same, just like I've shown previously. You can see tags here. Again, I think it's too small, but you can see tags with values. And the actual values of these tags in memory are different. So in the tags that the engineer actually programmed the PLC, we can see, even I cannot see the numbers, but we can see, for example, 5700, but the actual value of the parameter inside the PLC when we're inspecting in real time the memory, the value is different, which means a different code is actually being executed on the PLC, and without deep memory inspection, the engineer could never know this. So this was the first method of hijacking the compilation process or the transfer process. The second method we have developed in our labs is a download procedure man in the middle. So what we're doing is we're breaking the security communications between the engineering station and the PLC, and we're modifying packets on the fly. So we're doing man in the middle attack. And here you can see an example from Rockwell. Again, I think the text is too small, but the important key here is we're actually taking SIP packets. We're breaking the SIP packets on the fly. They're signed with HMAC. So we have recalculated the HMAC ourselves. We replaced the signature of each packet. And we've modified the data in those packets. So we were able to modify data as it was sent from the engineering station to the PLC on the fly because we knew the hard-coded key Rockwell used to sign these packets. So we were able to recreate the HMAC and change the data itself. And the result, again, is the same. The result is the engineer thinks that one code is running because they're seeing the text code, but the actual bytecode is different. And again, the only way to know this is only if you inspect the memory. So these were the first two methods. They were quite simple to do. The next method is much more complex. The next method is actually implementing the entire protocol stack and the entire download and upload procedures, and actually implementing the compiler. So we actually were able to do this for both Rockwell and Siemens. how it looks like? It looks like this. So this is actually a client, my Python client, that knows how to interact with the PLC to both set and get programs. So what you can see here is a query in which I ask the PLC, hey, can you give me information about this specific program? In other words, I was able to recreate the entire engineering workstation logic and implementation and rewrite it myself. Another example is this. So I was actually able to query the PLC of what programs it is now running. So I was able to get a lot of information about all the programs the PLC is running. For example, I was able to get the actual text code, as you can see on the left side, and the bytecode. Now, I've talked before that the bytecode is actually binary, and we cannot understand this. So we, at Clarity, actually wrote a full decompiler that knows how to take bytecode, interpret this, and output what you can see here, which is representation of the instruction, the bytecode instruction, that's actually running on the PLC. The fourth method is to actually achieve remote code execution in the kernel. If we're achieving remote code execution in the kernel, we're actually part of the firmware. And if we're part of the firmware, we can control whatever we want. And obviously, we can control the highest level of the application layer. And if we can control the application layer, we can change the logic to whatever we want without anyone noticing it, because we're part of the brain. We're part of the firmware itself. And we were able to achieve this with Siemens, which was very complex. It took us, I think, in total 1 year of developing this technique. And the root cause that allowed us to do this was because Siemens forgot in one of their VM, virtual machine interpretation of the bytecode, they forgot one of the checks that allowed us to write code into the kernel. And with that, we were able to escape the sandbox of the PLC, write code, write shell code into the operating system protected segment, and modify the code as the PLC is running. So we were actually able to modify the internal structures and the internal functionality of the PLC without it even notice it. So attacker with these techniques can achieve anything they want the most stealthier way possible, because even the PLC is not aware of the actual code is running. It's like rewiring your brain. You cannot know this because it's part of your brain. OK, so let's do a quick summary. Sorry for being too passionate. We've talked about 4 methods. OK, 4 methods for hiding code on PLCs. Obviously, these are advanced methods, and most attackers will not get even close to this, and they will just do some kind of Modbus query and change parameters. But I think in order to improve ourselves as a community, we need to understand, investigate, and research the deepest levels we can. OK, so we've talked about intervention in the compilation process. We talked about Stuxnet, and we talked about some other methods. We talked about download procedures, man-in-the-middle attacks. We've talked about implementing the entire protocol stack, including download, upload, and compilation. And we've talked about achieving remote code execution in the kernel level. All of these methods allow you, or attackers, to actually modify bytecode on the PLC without the engineering station to notice this. And this is the key for hiding code on PLCs. Now, the ways to detect this are complex. So sometimes you can inspect memory and find some disruptions or find some things that do not match. But in many cases, you can use the auditing tools, like when was the last download procedure to the PLC. Rockwell took this step. Again, we're working very closely with both Rockwell and Siemens, and we're helping their security teams to understand these attack vectors. And Rockwell actually came up with a very sophisticated solution to this problem, and they developed a mechanism, a very complex mechanism to detect code alteration on the PLC. So I'm not sure exactly the inner working of this new tool they developed, but I think what it does is it's pulling bytecode from the PLC, decompile it, and make sure it matches the actual text code. So this is very deep tech. It's very complex to achieve this. And I think that Rockwell succeeded. So I really think that this kind of research pushes the boundaries on security and raises the level on security in the entire community. Now, the obvious things to prevent this is network hygiene and policies and everything being discussed before. But I think we really need to move on to the next phase of talking about security. We need to move to code signing in PLCs. So we need to couple the text code and the bytecode so you could not change one without the other. And we need to talk about complex PKI, public key infrastructure systems. For example, Rockwell is pushing SIP Secure, which is an amazing PKI system. Siemens are doing the same with their TIA V17 features. We really need to talk about the next phase in OT security in order to achieve secure systems. Now, to summarize this session, I want to say, yes, OT is old and security systems are, OT is old and ICS systems are a legacy. I understand this. But convergence is inevitable. We're seeing right now, you actually can control some PLCs with your iPhone. Code assist platforms allow you to download and upload code through the internet. So it's not a remote dream. It's happening right now. And in order to prepare this properly, we need to go deep into the security mechanisms and into the architectural designs of ICS in order to improve them before an attacker is controlling your ICS systems from their phone. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Sharon Britsonoff. Ladies and gentlemen, we have time for some questions, and I'm here to support Mr. Britsonoff for his Q&A session. First, we'd like to open it to the floor. We have microphones here, which we paid good leasing money for. Please use it. Thank you. We have a question from this gentleman.
Thank you for your very interesting presentation. Would application whitelisting prevent what you are doing from happening? Thank you.
So can you repeat?
Could you just say the question one more time, please?
Could application whitelisting prevent what you're doing from happening?
So it depends how you define whitelisting. The short answer is no. I mean, if the engineering working station can change logic on the PLC, so attackers could do the same. You would need to whitelist the entire OT network with specific applications and specific ports and firewalls in order to prevent attackers from remote computers to do that. But it won't help you if the attacker is on the engineering station and the engineering station can communicate with the PLC. So the short answer is no.
OK, thank you for that question. Do we have another one? Yes, thank you.
Hey, thanks for the presentation. You had mentioned that Rockwell had implemented a rather complex, verification mechanism where it decompiles the bytecode back into text code. Would that prevent your third vector of injecting shellcode directly into the kernel?
I think you're referring to the fourth one of remote code execution in the kernel. No, it will not prevent this. No. Right. If you're part of the kernel, you can modify the actual checks on the PLC. So right. It's like a God mode. You cannot do anything.
Yeah, I thought
You,
so.
just, you need to prevent the RC from the beginning.
Right. Thanks.
And we have a question here from Slido, because I heard the gentleman mention something about vector. So I hope I'm interpreting the relationship to this question on Slido correctly. The question is, to replace the existing compiler, what was the attack vector used or thought of, and how can we prevent such access to the operator machines?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the attack vector was to attack the engineering working station, and I assumed that the attacker is already on the engineering station. The attack vector can be, there are multiple attack vectors against, usually they're Windows-based machines, so we can talk about domain admin, we can talk about lateral movement inside the OT network, but eventually my base assumption in this was that the attacker is already in the engineering station. So I've not dealt with how the attacker got into the engineering working station. I assume since it's a Windows-based machine, there are ways to get into the engineering working station.
Thank you. And this other question is from someone who identifies as GKY. If our PLCs are non-internet facing and only privileged users with proper authorization can download and upload under our supervision, is that safe enough against cybersecurity concerns?
It depends. I mean, basically, maybe. It all depends if the attacker can reach somehow to the same authorized machines that are allowed to do the download procedure. So I understand the whole concept of firewalls and segmentation, and it really reduces the risk. But eventually, theoretically, if the attacker is on one of the machines allowing to communicate with the PLC, then our attack vectors are valid. But the short answer is, if you're using segmentation right and network hygiene right and firewalls, you definitely reduce the risk tremendously.
Okay. Now, this is with reference to the first attack scenario. Can you force the engineering station to always upload the actual bytecode and decompile it instead of pulling the text code, or else prevent it to download the text code to the PLC at all?
Yeah, so this is an amazing question. The short answer is no, because engineering working station, as they've been designed and developed, is that they're using the text code, only the text code. So they're actually storing the text code on the PLC, and when they want to get back what's running on the PLC, they're not even touching the bytecode. They're just pulling back the text code. So if an attacker changes the text code just like we did and stores a malicious version of the text code on a PLC, there is no way for the modern engineering working stations to actually know that something is off. And Rockwell has developed this amazing new tool, which is, again, very highly sophisticated, that knows how to pull the bytecode and alert you if something is wrong, if there is misalignment between the actual bytecode and text code. But again, this is a tool that was just released. It's not part of, it's part of the engineering working station bundle, but it's not incorporated into the engineering station. So yeah, good question.
Okay, this one asking, what tools or processes can we put in place to prevent or detect the attacks you mentioned for PLC? Now, when we talk about what can we do, the possibilities are possibly quite numerous. So maybe you can also, I would like to add on to this question, what are the can-dos and what are the must-dos?
Yeah, so again, the basic answers are just like we've discussed many and many times, network hygienes and firewalls and segmentations and yada, yada, yada. That's fine. But in order to really understand what's going on in your network, you need some kind of visibility into your network. So you need some kind of a way to understand what are the packets are going on in your network, and you need to interpret and understand these packets. So you need some kind of sophisticated ideas. That's one. The second, you need strong auditing tools. So Rockwell Engineering Working Station and the Siemens Working Engineering Station are you do have some great auditing tools that can notify you or let you know through logging and auditing tools when was the last download or when someone connected to the PLC. And you definitely need to incorporate these tools and parse these logs routinely in order to understand what's going on in your network. So the short answer is both strong IDS, OT focused, and parsing the auditing tools output.
Okay, and this relates to a topic that was touched on at last year's OTCEP about zero trust. Where do you stand on that in stopping alterations to bytecodes?
Yeah, so I've talked about PKI systems. These systems are part of the zero trust. The PLC is configured to communicate only with a specific certified engineering working station by enforcing certificates. So these PKI systems like Rockwell SIP Secure and Siemens TIA Portal version 17 and above are great examples to what we need to move forward to. These systems really help to reduce the risk by forcing the PLC to communicate with only certified engineering working station.
Is there anybody on the floor here who might like to voice a question? Otherwise, I'll move on to the next slide or question. Okay, this one has me slightly concerned, and I hope the person is actually operating in cybersecurity, defending, rather than the other side of the aisle. Getting access to actual PLCs is hard. What resources and training would you recommend for someone getting started in practicing PLC hacking?
Doing CTFs. Doing CTFs, yeah, that's the answer. You would need basic understanding of IT cybersecurity, and then you can move on to understand OT protocols. And I think the best way to do that is by hands-on, by doing CTF challenges. There are a lot of IT-focused CTFs, but also some great OT-focused CTFs. So hands-on.
Okay, so would that answer also apply to this other question, asking about whether there's anything a PLC programmer can do to prevent or at least detect attacks with the PLCs as they are today?
Not necessarily the PLC programmer. I mean, there are best practices for PLC programming, but we're not talking about the programming itself because we're talking about alteration to the code. So in order to detect these attacks or techniques, you would need to do, as I said, use the auditing tools developed by the vendors. You would need to go very deep into your network visibility and understand what's going on. You need some kind of OT-focused IDS. You would need tools to gain you visibility into what's going on in your network and between the devices.
And this question would like to, the person who posed the question would like to understand a bit more about what happened in the Stuxnet, Triton, Rogue 7 or similar attacks. Why are they considered so dangerous, and what are the top lessons that we can learn from it?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think what's so dangerous about them is they're being stealthy. They're being hard to detect and hard to respond to. So if you know what you're dealing with, you can act upon. So you can do and react. But if you do not know it exists and you do not know what you're fighting against, it's very hard for you to even start understanding what you're doing and how to deal with it. So I think what's dangerous about these attacks, and actually why we started this whole stealthy code techniques, is to understand the attacker's approaches into how they hide code on PLCs, so we could, as defenders, react and respond. So, great question.
Okay, let me see. There is a number of questions referring to vendors. Sorry, not very good at multitasking here. Still kind of old school. I like my buttons. Okay, this actually is asking from a vendor's point of view. Okay, I think someone's asking whether or not how vendors can actually perhaps improve on the architecture of what they provide in terms of products. Let me see if we can look for, yes, that's the correct one, yes. Are there any requirement for a change of architecture, and what could it be?
Are there any requirements? Yeah, so we're working very close with the vendors. We have a monthly meeting with some of the market-leading ICS vendors talking about security and architecture, and we're talking about the next generation security and next generation PLCs. And again, a part of the shift in security is to talk about PKI systems and code signings. So these features, or these, I would call it security mechanisms, have been implemented in IT many years ago. And I think in order to improve our security in OT, we need to start thinking in these terminologies. So we do need PKI systems in OT. We do need the PLC to be controlled and maintained by certified machines. So to improve the architecture, we need to move forward into a deeper security, and we can take a lot of ideas from the IT.
Okay, from at least my point of view, from some of the responses and a bit of the reading I've done, I get the sense that I think hackers seem to be only starting to really look into attacking ICS, PLCs. Are those in a defending position in general? Do you see us as being perhaps one step behind, the hackers out there? And this is also related to another question on Slido, which is asking for your view on what kind of intentions and motivations from these attackers do you think they have? Because you say you've been talking to vendors, working on solutions, right? So to prevent them, you have to be one step ahead. So what kind of intention, motivations do you think they have in today's landscape? And because you've done hacking and all that yourself, at least in competitions, where do you see the next danger point, which is not yet at this point in time evident?
Yeah, very good question too. What I can share from my experience, again, my experience from working at Clarity, is that most ICS attacks, as we have seen today, are opportunistic attacks of script kiddies taking engineering working stations, scanning Showdown, and just connecting to one of the PLCs that are internet-facing and modify parameters. They have no understanding of the OT processes, and they have no intention to hide their code. But that's the majority of opportunistic attacks. Now, the ones that will want to hide their code are obviously nation states, attackers that are sponsored, maybe huge crime organizations. They want to have some kind of a physical disruption. Very highly resourced attacking groups. And these attacking groups will invest a lot of money and resources into hide their steps, because obviously they don't want to be caught for many reasons, whether it's intelligence or whether it's because they're breaking the law. So only the heavily resourced attacking groups will go that far into hiding their steps. And we want to protect from these types of attacks too. So that's why we invested a lot of time in our research groups at Clarity into understanding the next phase of attacking techniques in OT.
Okay. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for questions from Slido, but I'm just going to put it to the floor again in case there's any more from the floor. Mr. Brizanov, do you have any concluding remarks you'd like to share with the audience here, given the sort of question train that we've seen so far?
Yeah, so they were really great questions. They touched exactly the points I was talking about. So I think we're in the right direction. So I'm working a lot with the leading ICS vendors, and they do understand the risks, and they do understand the potential damage of what happens if attacker will hide their steps breaking into PLCs. And I think we are in the right direction with the new PKI systems that Rockwell, Siemens, GE, and other vendors are developing. So I think we're on the right track with the new security in OT.
Yeah, there are actually a few more questions on Slido. So how can people contact you if they would like to, tap on your expertise or interact with you, your social media handles, perhaps?
So they can reach me by LinkedIn. I don't have Twitter, sorry. Or I'll be here hanging around, so you can reach me, and we'll have a fruitful discussion about PLC hacking.
Excellent. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Please put your hands together for Mr. Sharon Britsonoff. Thank you very much.